Thank you once again for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. Appreciate all of you for being with us on this Monday edition of the show. All right, BYU got 2 commitments over the weekend. From my own math, I think it puts the finishing touches on BYU's 2025 recruiting class. Now, what used to be National Signing Day, it's now like the late signing day, comes up early next week as BYU will have these players put pen to paper, or in many cases, their digital signature on the paperwork online, then file those national letters of intent. But they got two new commitments over the weekend, both of them on the defensive side of the football. And I think both of them have markers or hallmarks of guys who could be really fine football players for BYU in time. Let's start off with cornerback Jordyn Criss. Now, we talked about him last week, came on an official visit over the weekend and announced on Sunday that "I'm home" is the term he used when he put out the graphic on social media. The one thing I love about Jordyn Criss is he's built in the same form or model of what a lot of the young cornerbacks that BYU's recruited recently are. Think what Trey Alexander III was this past year. He's this tall, long, rangy athlete at cornerback. Yeah, maybe a little bit skinny, but when Trey was on the field, pretty darn good football player as a true freshman for BYU and figures to only get better with time. Obviously, working out in the weight room, working on his craft. Well, Jordyn Criss is in a similar model to what I see from Trey Alexander. 6'2", 165 pounds, depending on which recruiting service you happen to frequent. An 85 rating, so mid-tier 3-star athlete out of Arlington, Texas, and Seguin High School. And I think this is a really under the radar pickup from Gennaro Guilford for his cornerback room. I talked with Gennaro during bowl prep. Some of you who are everydayers may remember that conversation. And in there, I asked him, "Hey, what are you looking for in terms of recruiting?" And he said, "I'm looking to add 1, maybe 2 guys." But he made it very clear it didn't have to be a JUCO or a transfer portal guy to bolster BYU's cornerback depth. He thought he could find the right guy out there on the recruiting trail, and he's identified it here in Jordyn Criss. I think Jordyn Criss bears all of the hallmarks, all of the markers, runs a sub 11 second 100 meters, 10.8 is his fastest time. It usually translates over to the low 4.5s or high 4.4s in a 40-yard dash, if those of you wondering what his 40 time is going to be. But a lot of coaches out there will tell you, when it comes to skill positions, particularly at cornerback, you want to have guys who can run sub 11 second 100 meters. That shows they have the speed to stay with the fastest receivers out there. And once again, his measurables, you can't teach the height and length that he shows at 6'2", 165 pounds. You like guys like this because you can bring them into BYU's program. He's not going to be pressed into service because he has to play right away. But if he comes in and proves to be a capable player, much like a Trey Alexander or even a Jonathan Cabella, who much like Jordyn Criss comes from the Dallas-Fort Worth area this past season, they both forced their way onto the field because they were good enough players as true freshmen this past year. Maury Bamba is still expected to pursue another year with BYU due to that junior college rule, that blanket waiver that was issued, and him coming back secures probably at least 1 starting spot. I think Evan Johnson figures to probably be the early favorite to fill that other cornerback spot. But then Trey Alexander, Jonathan Cabella, and heaven forbid, a guy like Jordyn Criss comes in and earns playing time as a true freshman. It shows, once again, that Gennaro Guilford is an absolute magician when it comes to finding talent out there on the recruiting trail. I know some of you are going to crow, "Well, doesn't have other Power 5 offers." I don't care about that. Gennaro Guilford, his track record suggests if he recruits a guy and gets a guy to commit to BYU, I trust that the Gennaro Guilford, who played at BYU, knows what it takes to succeed at a high level in a BYU uniform himself. He has a track record of cranking out top shelf cornerback talent. Look at Jacob Robinson. Look at not Chris Johnson. Who's the kid I'm thinking of? Chris Wilcox. Think of the guys that BYU has had at cornerback in recent years. Obviously, you look at Eddie Hecker. You look at Camden Garrett. You look at Mark Collins this past year. They were the 1-year grad transfer guys who came from Weber State and knew Jay Hill's defense. But everybody that Gennaro Guilford has coached up during his time at BYU, they've been pretty darn good football players. And I think Jordyn Criss bears every single trait you want to see in a cornerback that, given adequate time and development, should succeed at BYU in the long term. So I really like this pickup. Now, the other pickup over the weekend went in favor of Landan Goff, who's a local prospect out of Lone Peak High School. Now, Lone Peak, cranks out a lot of talent every single year. Austin Pay, one of his teammates, speaking of Landan Goff, committed to BYU, is one of the crown jewels of BYU's recruiting class. Landon's not nearly rated that highly. He's a low 3-star on 24/7 Sports with an 82 rating. He's the 36th best prospect in the state of Utah, but at 6'3", 185 pounds, and figuring to play safety for BYU. Landan is a guy that I have had the opportunity to call a number of his football games. And what I can say about Landan Goff is he is the consummate football player. And okay, what does that mean, Jay? That's a nebulous term. Why are you talking about football players? The one thing I love about Landan Goff, he essentially did everything in his high school career for Lone Peak High School. You need him to do this, he did that. You need him to do that, he just did it all. I called the game this past year for KSL Sports Rewind, as many of you know, during the football season. I'm out there on Friday nights calling a game. I was at Westlake High School, so a stone's throw away from where I live in Saratoga Springs. I was at Westlake High School, and they welcome in Lone Peak. Now, Lone Peak obviously was on their way to an incredible season. Westlake was struggling mightily because Westlake, their quarterback play was subpar. Well, in the game, Lone Peak lost their own quarterback, and suddenly the game devolved into something out of the 1910s of football. Neither team could move the football on each other because the quarterback play just wasn't up to the standard that either team needed to be effective. Well, enter Landan Goff. He returned a kick for a touchdown. He had a pick 6 in that game as well, and essentially became the de facto offense or the scoring that Lone Peak needed to grind out a win against Westlake. I came away very impressed with him as a player. And like I said, he's not very highly rated as a prospect, but I look at this and I say, you know what? You could do a lot worse than bringing a guy like this into the program. Now, as of the current time, I don't know the status with regards to if he's a preferred walk-on versus a scholarship guy, but that doesn't really matter to me because I look at what Goff offers, the traits similar to what I just talked about with Jordyn Criss. This screams Jay Hill's favorite project to bring into BYU. And all of a sudden you see him 2 or 3 or 4 years from now, because if I'm not mistaken, Landan is planning on a mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So you will not see him until 2027 or 2028. But when he does enroll at BYU, this screams a guy that Jay Hill could transform into one of the next star safeties for BYU. I look at this and I look at Landan and I say, you know what? He shows a lot of the similarities to what made Tanner Wall, or what makes Tanner Wall, I should say, a standout player for BYU at safety. Remember, Tanner Wall is a guy who was a walk-on with the BYU football program, was a wide receiver, kind of languishing in that wide receiver room. Entered Jay Hill. He flips over to the defense playing safety and has become an absolute stalwart at free safety for BYU, speaking of Wall. Landan Goff, I think, could follow that similar career trajectory under Jay Hill's tutelage. And watching what I watched with Landan Goff, and I just mentioned that one game against Westlake, I can think of like 3 or 4 others that I've watched him. He is a do-everything player. You're going to ask him to do something, he's going to do his absolute darndest to get the job done, and he just contributes to winning football. That's the one thing I love about the Lone Peak football program is their guys, they just want to win football games. They don't necessarily care about accolades. They obviously love winning state titles and winning all conference honors and all that type of different stuff. That's great, but it's a byproduct of them buying into what Coach Bart Brockbank at Lone Peak does. And I think this is what Landan Goff will bring to BYU, because I think all of us look at what their culture is under Kalani Sitake. It requires buy-in. Guys come into this football program, they understand what they're representing, speaking of BYU and by extension, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and they want to go put on a very good product and compete at a high level in football. That's why I think guys like Jordyn Criss and obviously Landan Goff are maybe underrated prospects. But the crazy thing is, if they live up to what I think these coaches see in both of them, they could emerge as some of the best players in the recruiting class themselves. Recruiting rankings are one thing, and I get that. There's a correlation with a 4 and 5-star to having high-level football programs, but I still look at what BYU does, their development program with their players and the guys that they bring into this program. And the thing is, they may be 3-star prospects when they come to BYU, but by the end of their careers, a lot of them are producing at a 4 or 5-star level, and that's a really, really cool hallmark of what Kalani Sitake has built in Provo, and I think we should all celebrate that fact. And the hope is the guy like Jordyn Criss or Landan Goff that come 3-4 years down the line, you're like, wow, I remember when that guy committed. He was such a low-rated prospect, but look what he accomplished in a BYU uniform. And that's what I love when it comes to BYU's. Yeah, they would love to get more 4- and 5-star talents. There's zero doubt about that. But in the meantime, bring in these 3-star guys who have a chip on their shoulder, and they go out there and produce at an extremely high level, much like those 4- and 5-star talents. Hey, you'll take winning football no matter how you can get it as a BYU fan.